and recycling. Just tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yes. What we mean there in terms of safe materials, we use a particular methodology to be sure that the materials, or the chemicals that are used in product, that they are safe for human health and for the environment. That means when you use new materials, let's say that a full assessment is being done in terms of the chemical composition there, and if there are particular chemicals being used that might not be friendly, let's say, to human health and environment, that they're really optimized and new alternatives are being found. Now you can think there's a big trend, of course, on bio-based print, inks, for example, or other chemicals. So really looking also in new chemical solution. That's a very important aspect when we think about materials. In closing the loops with the high value cycling, why this is also important, because we want to avoid that we have hazardous materials, for example, or materials that have a negative effect on the environment, that we loop them basically in the system.
You mentioned particularly the bio-based materials and the responsible sourcing practices that are necessary. What sort of characterizes these responsible sourcing practices?
Yeah, so we definitely have a whole set how we also define that. It has to do on the one hand with environmental feedstock choices, so looking at how the feedstock, the raw materials are being produced, how they're being grown, the whole practices around it. So let's say more from a resource use point of view, but we also look at the social practices in terms of responsible sourcing. So everything that is related to due diligence and to human rights and to social policies.
Okay, and in terms of the design with intent principle you talked about having sort of the end in mind. Is it the end, or in fact, rather than the end, the kind of next rather than the end? Is that part of it as well?
Absolutely, that's what it should be. I said here with in the end in mind, but it's really having the end of one maybe life cycle in mind, but then thinking, of course, on the next use of the products, because we really want to intend, for in the design for multiple usages of a product or of a material.
And then finally, your bigger picture principle. So what are the kind of main challenges? I mean, what do you look for from a designer if you're thinking in terms of the your bigger picture principle in particular?
Yeah, so I think what we in particular look for is that the designers, of course, have a good understanding themselves what happens with the product after the immediate or after the first life cycle. So, I said it can be set up for being reused, for example, so that they understand how reuse models work in the supply chain, or how can I help as a designer to increase, for example, the performance of a material, that it lasts longer, or that it can be easily repaired. Or, if it's for remanufacturing, used in a remanufacture, how can I design it from the beginning to have it easier, let's say, disassembled, and also understanding, what is needed in a remanufacturing stage, for example. So really for them to understand the processes or the platforms that happen after the first life of the product, and keeping that in mind from the beginning on.
Great. No, thank you very much indeed. That really set the scene really well. Thanks very much indeed. So, John, perhaps I can turn to you now. Give us your single sentence of context-setting introduction. But then, what are some of the key practical things that designers need to think about when they're designing products? And why is getting a better grasp of sort of in the factory practicalities? We talked about this when we were thinking about issues for this session, didn't we? So I thought it was really interesting. So perhaps give us some of the things the practical things that designers should keep in mind, and why. I mean, as an example, thinking about what's going on in factories when production is happening, that needs to be kept front of mind. John.
Sure. Yeah. I think Christina set the table really well in the fact that we've had a lot of luck and a big focus getting designers to think really in context of the entire system of product creation and what it takes to bring that product to life and what happens with it afterwards. It's not really enough to just think about material selections and using preferred materials. It's really taking a more holistic look about the product and the implications of choices. So, that is, one thing that we've really done is trying to get designers to understand sort of where materials are coming from, where product is being made, the conditions in the factories, And when we show that to designers or we bring them into factories, one thing that's really jumped out recently is the amount of waste that's created. And it's triggered a lot of thinking about use of dead stock material, reduction of dead stock. What are the practices that we are contributing to that? And how can we help reduce it? How can we use it? And then, on the footwear side as well, there's a big initiative among our footwear designers. They're referring to it sort of internally as no piece left behind. They're looking for opportunities to use cut-off materials to make smaller components. So there's all kinds of thinking that can happen when they understand the conditions in the factory, and oftentimes they don't have visibility to that until our supply chain or operations team sort of can reveal that to them. I think the other big piece that we've at New Balance been really focusing on is alignment and sort of the power of alignment. Everybody is, I think designers are naturally creative people. They want to explore, try new things. So I think that's sort of the easy part, but you end up following a lot of disjointed efforts potentially, and it becomes much more powerful if everybody's moving in the same direction. And it's in ways that you don't often think about. I think we often hear a lot of pushback about, well, I can't make that change to a preferred material because it costs more. And that might be true on a one-on-one, case-by-case basis. But when we start to look across the brand and start to consolidate and build volume behind something, that enables our development and sourcing teams to then talk to vendors in a different way. We can often make changes that we wouldn't have been able to make on an individual, product or product line. So that alignment is really important in terms of making those changes possible. And then the other really powerful thing that comes out of that is just in terms of storytelling, like brand storytelling. We can't tell a million different stories at the same time. So if we all are pulling in the same direction, it makes it much easier for their brand to kind of have a point of view. Everybody is sort of moving in the same direction, telling the same story. And it prevents conflicts as well. We've had cases where one team is pursuing a new dye technique that is, saving water. There might be another dyeing technique that is sort of might require more water, but has other benefits from a chemical perspective. And so how do you kind of balance that out? And what is the perspective at sort of a brand level? Like, how do we come across as not being sort of conflicting? So, that's really been, it's really getting designers involved in understanding the bigger picture context. And it's not just about, making this material selection or this material selection. It's kind of thinking big picture and understanding the impact of those choices throughout.
Okay, why don't you unpack for us then? You give an example of a sort of a potential conflict, your dye example for, why don't explain to us, how would you resolve that sort of conflict?
Yeah, it's really bringing those discussions as early in the process as we can. I think we struggled for a long time making choices too late, or having it driven more from the development end rather than the design end. So if we can build things in at the brief level and sort of empower the design teams to understand implications of what's in that brief and how it connects to the bigger picture at the brand level, they can start to push back and have a lot of discussions very early on to get aligned so that we can fix it earlier. It's much easier to sort of address that and sort of get a collective decision at the very beginning before decisions are already made.
Sure. You talked about storytelling. I think it's really, really important. I mean, they can get the sort of the narrative right for, across the board. How do you get your suppliers involved in that storytelling?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it sort of depends. Our tier one, it depends what the product is and what the material is and what the story opportunity is. Sometimes it's really important and really revealing to bring the supplier directly into to be part of the story. Other times it's more invisible. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that. I think oftentimes if we can work with a supplier and they're a core part of the offering, and so for example, we have some projects around circular materials where we're working with vendors to create new materials out of old material. And that's a very clear case where we want them to be really active participants in the storytelling. We want to reveal like what's happening inside the factory or inside the mill to enable that to take place. So they become a very integral part of the narrative.
Okay. Final question is on KPIs. You talked about you've involved designers, you take them to factories, and that helps them think about waste and everything else. So how do you bake in for them into their KPIs other sustainability things, and where does it fit within everything else? Cost materials, everything else, all the other things. Where do the sustainability KPIs fit in?
Yeah, we have KPIs that are really built around. So there's a couple ways to look at it at sort of a product level. We have a system internally that is sort of identifying product that contains a high amount of preferred materials. That having that common definition and identifier has really driven a lot of excitement throughout the teams. Everybody wants to have it, and so that alone is sort of a KPI, like percentage of SKUs that are meeting that definition or having a goal for that by whatever season it might be. Then at sort of a material level, we can build out the most preferred palette possible, but the teams have to choose materials from that palette, and that gets back to sort of the consolidation, empowering, leverage, and sort of sourcing decisions as well. So we can measure palette adoption metrics and see how well that that palette's being used. Why is it not being used if it isn't? Are they aware of the choices? So there's a lot of different internal metrics that we use in terms of material selection. And then at the waste level, we can start to look at yield percentages and things like that. So
sure. Okay, well, thanks very much indeed. Our questions are beginning to come in. Please do put your questions in the chat box and we'll come to them later. But yes, have your questions there and just be thinking about them. As very often in conference sessions, the brilliant questions come in right at the end of the time, and we do have a hard finish because we have another session to go to after this one. So please, let's have the brilliant questions earlier in the session as best we can. But anyway, thanks very much indeed, John. Christian, thanks very much for your patience. Perhaps you can sum up from what you've heard already, and in particular, think about what are the keys for engaging designers as far as you're concerned, and also the role of new materials in doing that. Christian.
Hello, Jan, and thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. A key, for sure, is to create facilitator role or department like Materials Innovation Lab. Kering set up in fact, the Materials Innovation Lab in 2013 to essentially service our brands and provide them with sustainable materials options. So we are constantly engaging our creative directors and our brands design teams. Our main goal is to give alternative choices at a level of quality that traditional or conventional materials have. So the role of new materials is key for us at Kering, and we are constantly proposing innovation to our brands design teams and exposing them to new frontiers of sustainability. So innovation, I would say, new materials and technology play a big part and drive sustainability forward in fashion. As I said, with innovation, I mean new materials, new technology, processing technology, and more broadly, new technology related to material treatments. Innovation is key enabler for Kering to achieve our sustainable targets. We have a target to reduce our environmental impacts by 40% in our operations and across our entire supply chain by 2025. And we already know that 50% of this reduction will come from implementing our Kering standards, and the other 50% will come from innovation. This includes alternative or sustainable raw materials, like, for example, alternative to leather, such as mushroom or mycelium, or bio-based polyurethanes, or new way, for example, of processing materials like biotech dyeing solution and no-wet processing technology for denim and so on. So we are always on the look for new solutions, And for that, we work with startups and innovators. We also collaborate with our peer industry to help scale up the new innovators which we came across, and also to build consensus. For example, like the Milo Consortium, Kering is a member of for mycelium mushroom labels. So for Kering, and I would say for the luxury, there are a few key things that have engagement for new materials. And I focus on luxury because it has very specific requirements. Basically, high quality in materials is essential, and also lead time to consider the specific brand's critical path. So it's necessary for sure to build up a, proper ecosystem involving suppliers, innovators, facilitators, stakeholders, in which designers and so brands have the opportunity to investigate it, validate, and implement new materials and technology easily, quickly, and also in a trusting environment, because this is key for us. Also to ensure that the material quality is at a very high standard. To do this, we work closely with our key suppliers in our supply chain. So another key point is that, but already Christina and John talk about it, is designers need to be engaged in the discussion about innovative materials from the beginning. And usually I say that in luxury, designers are involved in a creativity-driven process rather than in a design-driven process, and they are slightly different. And this creative process aims to reinvent aesthetic canons and to revolutionize both the aesthetic level and the social level. So our brands set the trends and innovate the language of fashion. So innovative material, from my perspective, have the same disruptive power, but it's necessary to introduce them in the right way and the right moment in the creative process. Also, it's necessary to find the right balance between early stage innovation, unexpected potentials of the innovations, and the designer needs. Considering, of course, the creative process itself. So I personally think that material samples are key to engage designers in the creative process, and new materials could be the starting point to develop new concepts rather than a reply after the decided concept and design. And if I have just a few other minutes, I would like to end saying that for the roles of new materials in luxury, there is an opportunity to redesign the concept behind the materials, merging sustainability with aesthetic codes of the brands. So innovative and sustainable materials are new tools with which designers can read the society and communicate their vision of sustainability to clients. New materials have a central role today, right now. It's important to start from the materials to set up a dialogue with the customers, and through materials, designers, brands can talk about sustainability to their clients. So it's really clear the importance of new materials in this process.
Great, thank you very much, Christian. Interested at the point around trying to find alternatives, new materials, innovative materials that are at the level of the quality of the original. Is there? I mean, there must be an occasion where there's compromise to be made. I mean, obviously, it may perform better than the original in some way, but perhaps not as well in another. How do you work to find the right, the compromise that works for individual materials when you're developing them?
Well, if we talk about a compromise and trade-offs, I would say that it means that there is a negative connotation about sustainability. So I don't want to talk about compromise indeed. It's also necessary to act to avoid the trade-offs, the compromise, or the limitation to styles. For us, is key. The designer have to be free in their creative process. So our brands set the trends, as I said, and innovative the language of fashion. And to ensure they have this creative freedom, it's necessary to support sustainability programs and projects. For example, our South Gobi Kashmir project, we set up with partners and elders in Mongolia. It guarantees that the sustainable cashmere produced compliance with our height standards. There are challenges our industry needs to overcome for sure to ensure sustainability always equal style, I would say. As I mentioned before, for luxury, we have a peculiar characteristics and we require high quality standard for materials. So luckily nowadays, the sustainability option compared to the conventional one or to the traditional one, for example, cotton, organic cotton, silk, cashmere, recycled nylon, are able to provide a higher quality standard compared to 5-6 years ago, thanks to an increase in quality and range, for example, of recycled nylon, or thanks to emerging availability of good quality GRS silk, for example, as well as certification aligned with our caring standard are increasingly widespread among our suppliers. So all these elements help to us to, to don't accept compromise or to mitigate, I would say, the trade-offs.
Excellent. And so, and I guess in my question then, I guess the answer is you just keep innovating until you get something which is across the board an improvement, or at least as good as the material you're trying to find a replacement for. What's the in terms of the innovation of new materials? Then are your customers asking you for alternatives, or is it an internal desire to create innovative materials that are more sustainable and avoid some of the impacts that the conventional alternative has?
Well, let's say that more than they ask it, they expect it. In the luxury, the quality is given for granted. So we need to provide them innovative materials. And when I say innovative materials, I mean also sustainable, because for us at Materials Innovation Lab, innovation is strictly connected with sustainability. So we are, for example, analyzing that are really promising also textile to textile chemical recycling technologies with closed loop chemical recovery or reuse. So it means that we can provide high quality, fibers, recycled fibers, or for example, are quite interesting and promising the fourth generation feedstock. I mean materials, the CCU materials, for example, carbon capture and utilization materials. And Christina talked about before the feedstock and the bio-based materials, and also here, even if not is a disruptive perspective, I think that transparency will be rewarding for the companies that are making efforts to provide bio-based ingredients considered more sustainable and certified feedstock, even if related to first or second generation feedstock. So it's expected from our clients to receive sustainable solution and also innovative, because as I said before, if you want to revolutionize the aesthetic canons, it's also necessary to use new solutions or to offer new solutions to them.
Great, Bill, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all our panel for setting the scene there. It's been a fascinating discussion so far. I'd like to turn to some of the questions from our audience. Question for you, John, from Lauren Hershey. You talked about thinking about your designers. And are your designers exploring alternative materials, or does that come from a different department, and who makes the decisions around alternative materials? And she asks, is there a sort of intentional, or maybe she means internal R&D, or what is the kind of level of R&D, and then where does it sit within the various different functions?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty collaborative. It's driven by sort of materials development. There are other more forward, like further out efforts that are driven out of innovation, I'd say. And design plays a role in sort of a collaborative team. We have a team that pulls together really a cross-functional mix of development, design, sourcing. I'm forgetting some others, but there's a team that's sort of looking at what are preferred materials that we're sort of getting behind. How do we build a roadmap to that? How does it slot into our inline plans season by season? And so it's we're really building that process out I'd say, it started over the past like 6 to 12 months to really build a better process around it and clean it up and make it, and it's getting to a point where it's working really well and driving a lot of progress. So that's been the most effective for us, is sort of having different teams focused on different aspects of it, but pulling all together in a group that meets, pretty regularly to kind of keep a track on how they're feeding into the overall plan.
Thank you very much indeed. A question from Paula Rogers. It was you, John, but I'd like to throw it out to everybody as well, if they'd like to have a go at it. And Paula's question is, if a sustainability champions program with formal processes, budget guidelines, and training support for employees and suppliers, would that allow them to innovate in a safe space and drive better design and responsible growth, do you think?
Sorry,
John, do you want to go that first?
Yeah, I might have missed the first part of the question. Sorry.
So it's basically, Paula's suggesting a sustainable champions program. So a kind of a program for champions internally, but with processes, budget guidelines, and training and support, and then allows designers to innovate in that safe space. Would that drive better design, do you think, and responsible growth? Paula asks.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand the idea behind that, I think it's probably pretty similar to what we've put in place, where we have, there's a lot of effort to get out into the organization and start driving a lot of conversations and identifying where there are sort of passionate leaders. I think within the design space, it's a pretty common interest area, and it's not a hard sell. So it's really getting those people involved in the most effective way possible, and arming them with information and making sure that the other teams that they connect with are kind of all on the same page. So I mentioned earlier, the fact that they're often receiving product briefs, and what is their role and what is their ability to kind of push back on that brief? Are there too many? So one thing that is I think a really important concept is to, around this idea of simplification, consolidation. It can drive a lot of sustainability benefits. So as they're seeing the briefs come in, like, are they in a position where they can push back and say, there are too many features that you're asking for, there's too many color options, like that in the end creates a lot of waste and could prevent the product from being able to be repaired or recycled, or whatever it might be at the end of life. So yeah, I think the simple answer is yes. It's incredibly powerful to get designers to feel empowered and to put them in a position where they have a voice, and the voice is being heard throughout the organization.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Christina, I'll come to you in a sec. Christian, I wanted just to turn to you, thinking in terms of material innovation. Is that sort of internal, safe space for innovation? Is that something that you recognise as at Caring when you're thinking about designing and coming up and innovating your materials?
What do you mean with safe space? I mean,
well, I guess what she's meaning is this. I guess Paula's really asking about, how do you encourage the innovation when you're thinking about new materials? Yeah, and how to encourage it internally.
Yeah, sure. First of all, defining clear guidelines and standards to benchmark new materials and technology is key. To frame new technologies and actively engage designers. Also, so that designer can easily and effectively incorporate them into their creative process. So Caring as an innovation standard, which covers new materials and technologies, it helps us identify key topics that need to be addressed when assessing the sustainability of new technologies and innovations, and codify some key issues in assessing innovation impact. So basically, providing these guidelines help a lot. If we want to talk about engagement or improve the innovation culture in the design teams, for sure it's necessary to set up an open innovation collaboration with innovators or with startups, because innovators require feedbacks and inputs from designers to address their technical challenges, to implement proper business model and production models. So basically it's a discussion that, feeds itself in some way, the discussion with the innovators. And of course, I would say that is also key to develop internal brand-specific innovation strategy, aligning brand's team with that. As John said before, the alignment is very key, setting common objectives, cross-functional roles, and developing a multidisciplinary approach. For that are necessary change management tools and initiatives that can increase, the involvement of designers.
Thank you very much indeed. Christina, thank you for your patience. Turning to you, what for you is the way to kind of really, how do you establish the sort of innovation and get everyone excited about the design process? And what would encourage that, do you think, or what would be your views on that?
Yeah, I think John and Christian, of course, mentioned a few important aspects already. I think what's important is to have really simple but effective tools for designer. In general, I think sustainability can be a very complex subject matter. Also, let's say innovations, we've heard about the trade-offs and the choices that might have to be made. And I think really creative, simple tools that are yet tangible for the designers, really helping them with the implementation, with the choices, with the briefs, I think could be a very, very powerful approach. And we see still there's a big need for simplification of language and what effect they have in the supply chain. So really maybe somehow translating the technical language more into a creative and an easy to understand language. That's definitely a key. I think it was also mentioned already the internal interlinkages that are important. So we have seen examples where really designers are interacting with all the different departments within a company, where you have co-creation workshops together. And I think that's definitely essential to get also the innovations in the different steps of a company. So really have some cross-departmental exchanges, because sometimes designers are maybe they coordinate with the product developers, but then there's a gap often to the sourcing and to the production, as we have heard. So the internal collaboration is important. And then I think definitely there is a lot of inspiration in the sector, but there are also other sectors that work with similar materials, that even work with particular textile materials. And for designers to have a platform to really go beyond their own sector and get inspiration from related sectors that might use similar materials for different applications. So typically a packaging sector is a very interesting area to look at, when you look at material innovation, just to be inspired and to see what is possible. Or sometimes if we think more of a let's say a classical kind of textile, you can also look at interior design, for example, for inspiration. So I think really this inspiration on material innovation across sectors is something where we see potential to also use this more and more and inspire designers about this and get really, really interested.
Yeah, Ian,
thank you.
I'll add a couple other things that came to mind. I think at the beginning of every season, or across apparel and footwear design, they sort of have a kickoff design week where the whole purpose is to get people excited about thinking, what is the future? What is the season going to look like? What's the sort of the blue sky vision and key themes to kind of rally everybody around? And that can be really important. The other thing in terms of setting a culture, I think, around innovation is just the expectation that, not everything's going to work, and that's okay. And almost being intentional that, okay, let's say we have X amount to invest, we're going to carve out a certain percentage to go after the most risky or most sort of unproven options. And, they may not work out, but that's okay. That's sort of the purpose of this investment, and to really give them the space and the time to break away from that sort of day-to-day inline process, to have sort of special projects that are intentionally carved out to focus on that. And that might be sort of an off-calendar process, or it could be a special collaboration. That New Balance does a lot of collaborations, and the role of those collaborations is often to pursue something that is slightly different, or to kind of prove out an idea that then we can take that lesson and roll it back into our more kind of scalable inline offering. So there's a couple of other things that have just come to mind while others were talking.
Thanks, John. Christian, I saw you nodding when you when John mentioned the fact that not everything's going to work. Is that important? You kind of the ability to get things wrong is how you'll actually get things right. Do you agree?
Totally agree. I would say that the innovation is a failure success process, and designers need to be ready to use solutions. Also because the transition from lab to pilot stage is the most crucial yet challenging process in innovation. If innovators are not properly financed, supported, tutored, the innovation may not succeed. So it's very crucial. And also I think that behind that, generally speaking, it's necessary to implement also a new integrated approach in which I talk about luxury, in which fashion creativity is able to dialogue with technology. For example, when we call R&D in fashion, materials research and product development is different from the R&D in technology, that is research and development. Different languages, different words. It is necessary to find the common ground in which the technology potential of an innovation can be perceived and translated in the creative project by fashion designers. So, I mean, it's a very complex process in which are involved really totally different words, and it's necessary to create the right background, a safe territory in which to play seriously.
Thank you very much indeed. Christina, I wanted to put a point to you, a question to come in, thinking around the understanding of circular economy and circularity for design teams. Do you think, or is there lacking, do you think, clear guidelines for design to get circularity right? You know, the kind of concepts of circular design and the impact of every single decision in design. Is there anything available for designers, Christina?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are circular design guides out in the industry, you know, that might be from organizations like ours, that might be from collaborations, for example, with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that might be, you know, from guidance that's putting forward by the Global Fashion Agenda. So I think different organizations put forward circular guidelines. And of course, internally within companies, there are also circular design guides. We have several, you know, companies in the sportswear industry and definitely also in the luxury industry that have design and circular design guides internally. I think what's definitively still needed is to go more into the showcasing of the implementation, you know, how these guides are being implemented, how they really help designers, and make this much more commonly and broadly available, you know, to the broader industry. So really have a good library, let's say, of those showcases. I know that's done here and there, but not really on a big scale yet. Often, of course, it's staying within companies. So really inspiring with that on the implementation of these guides, I believe, is very important. And then, of course, the definition, or not the definition, but the understanding of circular design is evolving. As I also said at the beginning, you know, it's much more understood, you know, that safe aspects need to be part of it. That, you know, the circular economy has a link, of course, to a just and to a fair transition as well. And I predict, and that will also be necessary, that as we move forward, some of these guides will get more and more refined to also take a more holistic definition of circularity into account.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. John, I want to put a question to you. It's similar to a question I put to Christian earlier. And as Paula asks, she says it's it seems difficult, or it's difficult to tick all the boxes around sustainability to get the right scores on water, on carbon, chemical safety, waste, and everything else. So how do you approach that? And how do you prioritize one thing over another when you're making a decision, John? I mean, I said perhaps not an easy question, but what's the kind of thought process around getting the priorities right?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's probably brand specific. You know, if there's a particular, I think it helps for the brand to first understand where they're, what's driving their biggest impacts, right? And you could prioritize around that. Obviously, you don't want to pursue one thing at the expense of another. I think that's sort of a key, just a key principle to have in place. So, for example, we're really focused on driving down our climate impacts at New Balance, but we don't want to do that at the expense of water or some other consideration. So, yeah, it's difficult. It's really difficult because there's always, I think, to Christian's point, you don't really necessarily want to talk in terms of trade-offs, but people often think that way, and there is some level of trade-off in one decision. It's no matter what decision it is, you're making one choice that's going to cause some implication somewhere else. So yeah, I don't have a great answer for that. It's a struggle all the time, I think, to try to find the balance of what the right answer is. And there's no single right answer. It sort of has to be contextualized within the brand and what their priorities are and impacts.
Sure. Christina, do you want to comment on that? I mean, I know, Christian, we have talked about this sort of point already, but Christina, did you have a point on that?
Yeah, I would agree definitively with what has said. I mean, there are often there are trade-offs. In general, if you take a holistic sustainability approach, and it will be by brand specific where maybe the first priority is being placed. That doesn't mean they couldn't be addressed over time, these trade-offs, but maybe it's a matter of where do you prioritize if a trade-off occurs. And I think it's also something that definitely happens if we go back to design. If we think sometimes, design for longevity is of course a principle, but sometimes, that might have some restrictions then to the recyclability, for example, of a product, or to the biodegradability. So you also have sometimes trade-offs at those levels, and not only, let's say, on the material choices where you look at the overall sustainability topics. And I think it's really a matter, if a trade-off is there, to see what can be innovated at this point of time, otherwise to take a prioritization with a clear reasoning and in line also with the strategy of the company, and then of course try to innovate and learn from that and gain the experience that over time the trade-off can be mitigated.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious we're coming towards the end of our time, so I want to put a final question to all of our panel, and it's coming back to our session topic. Perhaps you could just think and give us one either disruptive technology or a potential new material that they think will be, that's exciting them, that they think will really get their design team and others in their organizations, or more broadly, excited. Christina, do you want to give us one single thing that you think is now the key going forward?
It's really giving materials and product a digital identity. So everything around RFID technology, for example, to track garments, across the different life cycles, I think will be absolutely key moving forward. Also for the designers to better understand, how the material choices they're making and the garment construction, how this impacts performance, durability, use behavior, recyclability, and all of those topics. And then being able to, from those learnings, around the digital IT of a material or product, from those learnings, doing improvements and new innovations.
Okay, thanks very much. Christian, for you, what's can you think about, is there a new material coming up that you think is going to be particularly exciting and engaging?
As I said before, rather than materials, I like to talk about processing technology. Textile to textile chemical recycling technology is really promising, not just on synthetics, but on cellulosic too. And one that is quite really interesting and promising for me, the new dyeing and finishing technologies, able to reduce water, chemicals, and energy consumption significantly. And several technology in this field are shaping the dry factories of the futures. So I strongly believe that in the next phase, rather than of new materials, we will talk about amazing process.
Great point. Thank you very much. And John, same to you. What's coming up? What should we be looking out for that you think is going to be exciting?
Yeah, I think I'd probably agree with Christian. I think some of the more exciting things that are happening inside the brand right now are really around, process, end of life solutions, and the materials and the design elements that either prevent that or allow that to happen. And it's really a combination of understanding technologies that are available, and how do we utilize them, or how do we put that into a product that matches the infrastructure and the technology that is actually, you know, capable of handling it. So
Great.
that's probably the most exciting thing right now, and the hardest thing to solve for.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, look, thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time. My thanks to the panel, to John, to Christina, and to Christian. Thank you so much. Your insight's been really interesting over the past 50 minutes or so. Thanks also to the audience for your questions. Lots of really interesting questions there. I hope we've had an interesting discussion. I've certainly enjoyed it. We're back at 22:03 UK time to look at consumer trust and the rise of brand activism, led by my colleague Toby Webb. And you'll have experts from Catherine Hamlet will be joining them, and Christopher Miller from Ben & Jerry's, and Jessica Long from Ipsos. Do join that. It's just 8.5 minutes, but for now, thanks so much indeed.